Hi, I'm Dr. Nicole Lipkin, and this is the Hey Kiddo podcast, where we talk about all things parenting. And today I am talking with Dr. Christner and Paul Wagner about how to help kids and parents cope with grief and loss. Dr. Christner is a licensed psychologist and Paul is a licensed professional counselor. And they are the hosts of the Psyched to Practice podcast. And I am so psyched to have you both on the show to talk about this very, very, very difficult topic. And actually, to be honest with you, the timing of this is perfect, Ray and Paul, because it's interesting. I have a 5-year-old, Charlie, and we just had to put our cat of almost 18 years old to sleep the day before his birthday last week.
Wow.
And, didn't tell him until after the birthday celebrations, and the cat was, super sick. But it's so interesting. And I'm obviously a clinical psychologist, but I have been stressing out so much about how to prepare him for this.
Yeah.
And it's really funny. It's like he's prepared me. He just likes to talk about how everything's dead. Like he's like, oh, because the cat had a sister cat, and is always like,
Right.
Krepla's dead. Puppo's dead, and likes to say that right in my face. It's like, but smiles when he says it. So yeah, this is one of those topics. It's like, just how do you prepare for it and all of that jazz. So I am very excited to dive into this with you. And, with that, in your opinion, in your experience, how do children's responses, to grief differ than adults and all of that stuff?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting. I kind of got thrown into grief with kids clinically by accident. Was working in a school and had a kid who came in, very similar story that you gave, where a pet died. And so in that particular child, we didn't really know what was happening, but the teacher started seeing behavioral differences. So they started seeing academics kind of go down, attention span. So, with kids, I think, oftentimes when we think of grief, we think of sadness. And with kids, I think that can be part of it, but we also might see withdrawal, we might see difficulty in social interactions, or even things like anger might come up. So we may see kind of a different range of emotions, and a lot of times we might see that behavioral piece where it's just a little different than adults, where they might be acting out because they don't know how to express the emotions they're feeling.
And to piggyback off of that, the social component and Nicole, your story there of like, just right in your face and saying it with a smile. I think there's a lot of confusion and curiosity around grief, where as working with adults, we can maybe talk a bit more about like the stages of grief. And the stages, I think, are still certainly present, but their presentations can be much different. And there's almost this exploratory of what is grief. And it's not just death. It can certainly be the loss of friends moving, or lost opportunities. Even kind of like I talked with kind of I guess more so adolescents that are going through transitions of like, I don't feel like I'm a kid anymore. Like I don't like playing with toys. So I think there can be a sense of grief for many different areas. And I think, we tend to think of death as that first experience of grief, but I think there's a curiosity, and it can be jarring at times.
Right. I think that's really important, to stress that with any transition in life, there's opportunity and there's loss. And with that comes grief and change. And so grief is not just about death, it's about transition. Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's interesting because we talk about behavior, because yes, I've seen in my own clients and my own child, one of the things I have noticed since the kitty has passed is more extreme temper tantrums, way more extreme temper tantrums that are like, woo.
Well, and it's interesting because I think with parents that's sometimes the most difficult, especially when we were talking about something like death or divorce. The parents are going through their own emotions, and then all of a sudden your child's now showing these behaviors they haven't in a while, and our tolerance level might not be as good. And so the natural instinct is we correct the misbehavior rather than pausing for a second and go, hey, they're going through this too. Like, there's we have these shared emotions. So, I oftentimes tell, parents, yeah, pay attention to those behaviors and talk about them, stop for a second and say, gosh, what's going on? It's different. What you're doing now is not what we're used to. And then having tried to find a little bit about what's going on with the emotional end, because a lot of times it's really not about misbehavior. It's about just big emotions that they don't know how to cope with yet.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Exactly. So, in your experience, have you seen differences in different age groups? And again, grief looks different for everyone, and it just looks different for everyone. But have you seen certain trends in different age groups?
Working with a variety of ages, and what I tend to find with younger children is, we're seeing more either like the tantrums or maybe even more like aggressive and violent play. So it might not even necessarily
Hmm.
come out in terms of like defiance, but it might be, I'm wanting to play war and I'm wanting to kill people, or I'm wanting to,
Yes. Yes.
and so trying to identify, and parents are then like, I don't know how to handle this. Like, I don't know what to do in this moment. And so to creating that sense of safety and security, and working to identify, like, if you're wanting to play and express in this way, I don't know if wanting to say it's okay like broadly, but hey, can we be understanding and compassionate towards why this level of play is coming out? And then I think we might also look into, like, as we're getting into like a bit more of like that, like adolescence age, I would say device usage maybe tends to change. And so we're going maybe towards more, if there's screen time, it's maybe we're consuming media that's either aligns or complements some of the experiences of grief that are going on. And I'm thinking I tend to see more aggression come out during that time period, but also a lot of like withdrawn or like social comparisons, I think, are another piece that can come out during that adolescence and into the early teen years as well. And then
Mhm.
I feel like at that point in time, at least through my experience, I tend to see more isolation and being withdrawn,
Yeah.
trying to cut out, it's like, I don't feel like talking to my parents. I don't want to talk to my friends. I just want things to be normal, but it's not normal. So I'm just feeling very alone. And then we start to see some of those more like kind of the sadness and like not necessarily knowing how to navigate that socially or relying on social
Right.
support. So like broadly, that's kind of what I typically see, but certainly it's an individual presentation for everyone.
Yeah, and I'd kind of add to that, the social media piece is interesting. And maybe not even just social media, I think just digital media. What I find now is even with I think older children, even pre-adolescent, the access to look things up is so easy.
Yeah.
So they're not understanding how they're feeling, and then they go into this rabbit hole of Googling what's happening, and then that leads to a whole bunch of other pieces. And so, again, kind of when we talk with parents, it's, you know, make sure we're having conversations, even when the kids say they don't want to have a conversation about it, at
Hmm.
least having some communication and giving information that they're not going down that path on their own. Because, there's just incredible things that you can find on the web that we don't want, kids to do. And depending on what search words you put in, when we talk about things like death and dying and
Oh,
loss,
yeah.
we're going to see some topics that are probably not not the best for kids to look at. And then the only other thing I would kind of add, and I think this does cross the developmental spectrum, is I oftentimes tell parents pay attention to sleep.
Yeah.
Sleep can be definitely a difficulty. I just had a little guy that I was seeing who about 8 years old, and he was afraid to go to sleep. His
Mm.
grandfather had died just not too long ago, and he died while he was in his sleep. And
Mm.
so the child was handling the loss part fairly well, but their
Hmm.
anxiety then increased. So, we just have to pay attention to all
Yes.
those little things.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's really important because it comes out in such different ways. And I think it's really interesting when we were talking about just the progression, like what you tend to see. It's very interesting in those tween years and those teen years, the kind of, I just want things to be normal. I remember vividly when I was 12, I lost my father. And when something like that, like that's the age where you're like, that's the, it's all about fitting in and socialization and what you're like, that's that, like, and a little bit earlier, that transition to it's more important what my friends think than my parents.
Right.
Just wanting to feel normal. That's so big. That is so huge. And when you have a loss like that, it's not normal. It's not, I mean, it is part of life, but it doesn't feel normal. And to feel on top of that grief, that loss of normalcy or what you think normal should be is so powerful. It's so powerful.
It is. And it's interesting. I just had an adult who I know that was going through a grief process. And one of the biggest frustrations they had was that people would ask them if they were okay. They would say, "Are you doing okay?" And this individual went, "No, like I'm not. Like, stop asking me this." And people were trying, like they were, they were trying it. And so I stopped for a second. And I said, "Yeah, what would you want to hear?" Like, so when people keep coming up to you, and especially when they were, through the funeral, it was, 50 people, everybody going, "Are you doing okay? Are you doing okay? Are you doing okay?" And, and she's like, "What's the right answer? Like, what answer can I give?" Because no, really, I'm not doing okay. But you can't say that. And so we had this dialogue, and it was interesting. And, the simple answer was she would rather people just say, "Hey, I'm really sorry you're going through this. If you need anything, reach out." It was that simple. It wasn't, because she's like, "I don't know when okay is going to be yet. That's going to take some time." And, so I think it's interesting. I think the dialogue that we have with people, we need to pay attention to it because, again, no one was trying to frustrate her. That was not the issue.
Of course not.
But it was, afterward I went, I would probably be sick of that as well. Like, I think after the first few, you'd be like, and at what point do you just, want to hear something different? So,
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that because I think this is, I mean, again, this is, if someone is lost, that parent is also losing someone, and that parent has to show up in a different way. And I think that's so important because what do you say to people? And I'm sure all of us have fallen into the trap where we've been like, "Are you okay?" And then been like, "Oh my God, of course you're not okay. That's the stupidest question in the world. Why would you be okay?" But it is so hard to know. And I love that you asked that client, "What would you like to hear?" And that is, sorry, no words, and I'm here.
That's it.
I think the other thing is a lot of times after the hubbub of like the loss and the hubbub and the funeral and all of that, it's like that after part when everyone leaves. It's how can you support people too in that long term in their life going forward.
I think that's a great point because I've seen that even in my, my own life when, I had to deal with deaths, and everyone is there, so it's like, everybody's around, everybody's like, "Hey, we're going to keep staying in touch." And then about a week later, that stops. All the connections kind of start falling off. And then you're left with your own thoughts. And then that support kind of falls down. And I find that interesting because I think that, that's something I think we could do better as a society is, how do we really, support people beyond just the words of saying, "Hey, I'm here for you." But, then we don't see that follow up later on. And then that person does feel alone, hopefully there's other family, but, I've worked with, patients, and I'm sure both of you as well, that they don't have that support, and it's a lonely endeavor at that point.
Yeah.
And I think it just reinforces that idea of, okay, we should be then, moving on and using that term very, very intentionally, because then there's almost this shame of, should I be at a different state, like, point right now? And I think, whether that's adults or children, if we see others kind of going about their day to day and we feel out of place, we feel that lack of normalcy, we almost start questioning what's wrong with me. Why am I not handling this in the way that, the others that were attending the funeral or attending this experience, or, that have moved, or whatever the
Yep.
transition is, why am I struggling? And, one of the most valuable things I think at least in the therapy setting, is just kind of acknowledging, like, I don't think it's supposed to feel okay right now. Like,
Yeah.
this sucks. Like, it's okay for it to,
Sucks.
like, it's okay for it to feel awful right now. And I don't want it to feel that way forever, but don't rush it. If you rush it, we know what feeling fake feels like, and that's not a good feeling. So,
Right.
like, how do we try to make it almost inviting in this new norm and this like discomfort, but trying to then navigate our way through it rather than trying to rush through it. And, one thing I really encourage is, like, let's not rush, but let's not get stuck either. And let's just try to say, like,
Hmm.
when do I feel like I'm in a place where I am not moving on, but I'm moving forward?
Absolutely. And I think when it comes to grief for adults and children, grief is not a state, it's an evolution. And the
Yeah.
truth is that it just gets different over time. It doesn't go away. You don't all of a sudden forget about the person you love that died or the pet that you love that died. It just gets different over time. The
Yeah.
relationship with it is different. And I think if, as a society, we can kind of change out, like we tend to be like, okay, there's a beginning, middle, and end to this, but there's not a beginning, middle, and end to losing someone or something that you love.
Yeah. It's, and Paul mentioned about this idea of moving forward. And I think that's where the words we use are so important. And, I always, I've had kids and parents come in and say, we have to move on. And I always say, moving on is different. It means we're leaving something behind. And so when we say it like that, it doesn't feel natural. And, so we, oftentimes would encourage, it's moving forward. You're moving forward with their memories, with everything
Mhm.
that person instilled in you. And even in cases that we're not talking about death, even, I've used this even with divorce. I've had kids that come in and they're grieving their parents separating. I'm like, listen,
Yeah.
your parents together did some awesome things. Like there were
Yeah.
moments that you can take
Yeah.
from that, and they made you the kid that you are now, which is an awesome outcome. So how do we take that and move the good pieces forward and realize there was just some negative things that happened, and how, and it's interesting, I think, when we get into that dialogue, even with young kids, it clicks for them. And they're like, yeah, like
Mhm.
I can bring the good things forward. I can bring all of that with me. And it's part of who I am. And, I've told people, you may grieve your whole life. I mean, I've known people
Yeah.
who, it's 30 years after a parent died, and they
Yeah.
they still have a hard time. And I've experienced it with my grandmother died many years ago, and I know the date. I think about
Of
her when that
course.
happens, and it's and
Yeah.
that idea of normalizing that, it's good. Like I often think we try to rush the grief process anymore. And we tell people, like, you got to move forward. I mean, I've had I've had people who've come in who, they've lost a husband or a wife, or, so mostly adults, or actually an adolescent I had that lost a parent. And it was interesting. Like their family doctor was like, hey, let me give you just a couple months of Prozac just to get you
Mm.
through this. And I went, no, like, it's okay to be depressed. Like, why do you
Yeah.
have to be happy? Like, let's be with those emotions right now. And that doesn't mean you have to be in that state 24 hours a day, but we will move forward with it better when we're in it for a little bit and we let ourselves experience it.
Right.
But as a society, we want to fast forward it, and it doesn't work
Yep.
that way.
Fix it. We want to
Right.
fix it, but you
It's
don't
a
fix
fix, right?
grief.
That's
Yeah.
right.
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 And I think, yeah, it's not a fix. It's not a fix. It's an
Yeah.
experience. And I think, that's the other thing. I think that we want to fix things quickly, and we want to judge when it doesn't look like we think it's supposed to look. Like,
Right.
I think, for example, like some young adults that lose people, they might need to shut it down and put it on the shelf until they're ready. Or an
Yeah.
adult might need to do that, or a kid might need to do it, but it doesn't mean they're not going through their own process.
Yeah.
So with that, I think that's really important. How do you start, let's say someone's sick in your family, like how do you start preparing someone for death or loss? If you know someone's sick, a family pet or a family member that's going to die, how do you start preparing children?
In that sense, I try to talk not about like, let's not make it the situation or let's not make it situation dependent, but let's just talk about how we then adapt to change and recognizing change can, at times be really exciting. Change can be really scary, can be really uncomfortable. And so if we can work and, I love what you're saying there, Ray, about, the societal like discomfort around discomfort, and yet we know, if we're wanting to challenge the experience of anxiety, if we're wanting to challenge, certain symptomology, like we have to improve our tolerance. And so how do we improve our tolerance for change? And I think it is through how do we kind of take a bit of the edge away from it? We normalize it. We allow ourselves to experience it. And so for children, I think it's, hey, there is going to be a change and we don't know what it's going to look like. And that doesn't mean that it's going to be, it has to be this terrifying thing. No, it's going to be sad, and it's okay for us to be sad. And, I don't know how long it's going to last, but again, that's okay as well. So just kind of allowing for those open-endedness and not feeling like, we have to have an answer. And I think so often that feels like a scary conversation for parents because like, I want to reassure, but if we're trying to reassure, we're kind of trying to rush along. And so, how do we try to give safety and security while also encouraging some tolerance for discomfort? I think is one of the more valuable things that, as parents are navigating that with their children, that they've come back and said that, it seemed like it was a helpful process for them.
I love that. I just want to reiterate what you just said because I love that. So instead of like focusing on what's going to happen, just talking more that a change is coming and we don't know how. We know it is going to feel sad, but we don't know how it's going to look or what's going to happen, but talking about it in the context of change versus death.
Yeah.
Yeah. And,
Love that.
and I think when we're, dealing with family members that are sick and, oftentimes in my work, it's been usually related to cancer as a diagnosis in a parent or a loved one. And, I think with that, talking about the change, but also being honest about what's happening in the situation. That if even with kids, I will say it's okay to use the word cancer. It's okay to say, yes, this is what's happening, and this is going to create the change in our life. And again, I think we're in a digital age that even young kids can search up, something on the internet that's, not great, but using the right language with kids. And I think even before we do that, even I tell parents oftentimes, prepare what you're going to say. Like, don't try to go in on the fly. Like, this is a conversation that you should stand in front of the mirror and kind of think it through. What are you going to say? Because chances are they're going through it as well. And I think, with that is also saying, like, I'm going to be sad. This change is going to be hard for me. I don't know how it's going to affect me, and trying to connect with kids in that way where they feel that you can collaboratively work through that process with them. And it is a process. And so I find if parents do that, it not that it makes it easier, it just empowers them and the child to work together differently.
And, to piggyback off what you were saying there, right? Like one thing I think is really valuable for parents to kind of acknowledge and talk about beforehand is kind of calling out the experience of those emotions. So, I think so often, there's going to be crying, there's going to be, a sense of withdrawal. Like I might not want to play. I might not want to, there might be days I don't want to get out of bed. And for some children, that might be their first time seeing their parents act or experience these emotions. And that can be a really scary thing on top of their own emotions. And so trying to normalize and give space for that. And I think it's a great way that we can model like, hey, there are things I'm needing to do. So sometimes I do have to go but also I might need to take some space. So how can we try to maintain some consistency while also meeting ourselves with where our experience of that grief is? And I think it gives our children then the same permission to, if they are then saying like, hey, how do we go through the school day but also then make space for, if I'm feeling really sad, it's okay for me to take that break. Or, if I'm feeling really angry, like how do I kind of go and express that in a way? And so trying to kind of demonstrate how we can be a bit self-aware with that. And it's not future telling, it's just, again, preparing for change.
So a couple questions with that. I think that's so important. I'm curious, once kids enter the teen years, that self-focus, that selfishness, it sometimes feels like selfishness or dismissiveness or whatever it might be when it's actually pain. What you were saying makes so much sense around talking to younger kids. It makes so much sense. But what about when you have a teenager?
That
Same?
throws that throws everything off.
Yeah.
Right.
Really? I mean, it messes everything up.
Right. Well, we weren't
Yep.
prepared for that question. Now it's now it is similar, but I think you sometimes have to frame it differently with teenagers. And it's interesting. I had someone is just going through a similar situation, and with the parent, we talked about not only the child needing them, but recognizing that they need the child, and meaning the teenager. And so the conversation was similar to what Paul said, but they actually said, I might just need you to be with me some days. I just might need you to sit on the couch. Like, I don't want you to console me, but right now, feeling connected is important to me. And I would hope and appreciate if you could help me with that. And it was interesting because this was I don't want to say a tough young guy, but he wasn't the most emotionally connected teenager. And that really helped him. And he actually sat down, he was like, I appreciate that my mom asked me that. And so they would just sit on the couch and watch TV together, and sometimes not even say a word to each other, but their presence with each other was important to both of them. And then at times he would say something, he would say something like, yeah, hey, I'm missing dad. Like that's and you know what? They'd both tear up and they wouldn't say anything else because neither one of them at that moment wanted to go further. And that's okay. Right. But they found a different way to connect and understand that they were both dealing with things. And over time, discussions did start happening, but they weren't forced. It was just simply, hey, you being here is important to me. And if you could just do that for me for a few weeks as we get through this. And again, it was so kind of collaborative and supportive for each other. It doesn't always have to be words.
Oh, yeah. And it's finding and I think that's so important. It's finding your way in your relationship. It's like emotional to hear about that.
Yeah.
And that's what I think is so important. There's no prescription here. It's doing it the way you need to do it with your family. On that note, talking to someone about someone else dying, when should the person dying talk to their kid? And how do you do that? I mean, that's, and we can stick with the younger kids for now.
Well, I think when we start to recognize, as the adult that, hey, my mortality is coming up. So whether that is, a terminal illness is, probably the most common experience of that. But this kind of impending feeling, and there's this desire to shield, but also, we're just almost creating ignorance. And especially, one thing I would really encourage is we can't hide, we can't shield our children forever. And in doing so, we're doing them a disservice. And so being able to talk with them and sharing about it, we're not talking about all of the dark thoughts, but how we view that relationship and making sure, that connection is there and it's recognized and it's felt and experienced. And I think, timeline wise, I think it's a very personal experience, but when we start to notice that we're changing our actions and behaviors, and if there isn't an answer for that, if it's, hey, why is mom or dad, why are they, so withdrawn? Why are they, so why are they getting so angry? Why is there more fighting? Because they notice this. And unfortunately, if they're in the dark, they're left up to make their own answers. And, we think a terminal illness might be the most challenging. They could think up something worse. And so being able to then have some answers for themselves, I think is really valuable. So, when we start to notice some behavioral changes for ourselves, I think that's the time to recognize that, okay, we're having a ripple effect and it's going to be witnessed and it's going to be experienced from others. So how do we not just leave them to guess or leave them in the dark?
Yeah, and
Right.
I often encourage it, I think the earlier the better.
Yeah.
In my experience with kids is every time we try to shield them, they know. They have an
Mm,
intuition, and I think we don't give kids enough credit sometimes to recognize the subtle changes that are happening around them. So, while that's a hard conversation, I do tell parents, like as early as you're ready. I mean, you have to get yourself emotionally ready to have that conversation,
yeah.
but earlier the better. Again, it's sometimes that's about then letting the kid have the opportunity to have some say so in the path forward until death
Mm,
does occur. And I had
mm,
a child several years ago, and was one of the hardest ones emotionally for me that I worked with, and he never had that opportunity. And in
mm.
our sessions, it was often, he's like, but I yelled at my dad. I yelled at him, right? Like I I was a
Oh,
jerk. I was, and not that he should feel guilty about that. He's a kid,
right.
but he does. At that
But he
moment,
does.
right? Yeah, and at that moment, he's like, if I knew, I would have done things different, and I would have cherished the time I had with him. And now he was a little older. I mean, he was 10 or 11 years old, but I think we have to give kids more credit and understand that telling them they can handle it. We don't have to shield them. They can handle
Mhm.
it, and they can be part of the process to make choices that they're able to, kind of collaborate to figure out what that time is going to look like before a parent has a diagnosis and, the outcome of death in many cases.
I I think that is so critical. It's that battle of trying to protect your kids, but like maybe we overprotect a little bit too much. And especially when it comes to loss. As adults, we want the opportunity to spend time with people we know we're
Mhm.
losing. Why
Mhm.
wouldn't children want
Right.
that time? And I think the other thing that I'm taking away from this is not only trusting that our children can handle hard things and that they might want to be part of the process, but also trusting that children can handle our emotion as we go through this, and that they're watching. I remember one
Yeah.
thing. My mom was extremely strong after my dad died, and I very rarely saw her cry. And as a result, I was very, very strong too, and very rarely cried.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
not to insult her process,
No.
but thinking that was the way that you handle this,
Yeah.
Sure.
and like I also remember an aunt saying, and this is like really, these small subtle things that we say to kids, an aunt saying to me, you have to be strong for your mom.
Right.
And me
Yeah.
interpreting that as I have to be, what is strong? Well, strength is and
That's
like
right.
we have to like I think I think this is so much part of the process, is recognizing the words we use,
Mm.
explaining what we mean, not assuming that kids know what you mean when you say
Yeah.
things like that. And strength is having a broad range of emotions.
Yeah.
Strength is feeling really sad. Strength is all of this stuff.
Mhm.
And when you were saying the broad range of emotions, that one thing I think is really valuable is also that, in some ways the emotions really, they're not finite, and others might want them to be fine. You have to be strong, which means we have to put
Yes.
a cap on these emotions, but we can really experience these emotions for such a long time. That's been grieving for 30 years, and
Mhm.
so not trying to say, oh, put it in a box, here's this regimented piece, but our
Right.
emotions are kind of limitless in terms of the the kind of both the intensity and the duration as well. So, we don't have to worry about like, hey, am I going to have enough love and compassion to give? As long as we're having those connections, the love and compassion follows. So it ends up being much more of a reactant rather than a commodity. And I think sometimes we almost talk about emotions as a commodity of like, those are, you're too big, or, it's too much right
Yes.
now. And we almost kind of self-impose those limitations.
In your professional opinions, when a child's really young and may not really understand yet the different, what death means, what's a good way to talk about it? And what's a good way to help, if a really young child loses a parent, to help keep that memory of that parent or that grandparent or whoever it might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think starting, I think we've said this kind of a few times in different ways, selecting the right words with kids. And, when we talk about death, I actually think we should use words like death and died. I saw a kid several years ago who his grandmother passed away, and his parents said, Nana went to heaven. And I remember him, I was working at a school at that time, and he came in and he said, Nana's playing a joke on me. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, Nana couldn't have gone to heaven. And I said, well, why not? And he goes, Nana takes her purse everywhere, and her purse is hanging on the back of the chair. And then all of a sudden, I'm like, as somebody who has all this training, I had no clue what to say. I went like, I'm not the one that's going to say it. Like, how are we going to do this? So, I think as parents, like that, not that we can't soften the language over time, but I think our initial conversation, it's okay to say, this person died, and we're going to have some changes that are going to happen, and it might be difficult for us. But as a family, we're going to be together. And I even think as young kids, and we're going to also talk about good stuff because, Nana or Fido or whoever we're talking about, they left really good things for us to remember. I think with really young kids, I encourage parents to use like art activities, and we don't have to just have conversations with kids. I've had parents have the kids draw out a comic strip of their favorite time that they had with a relative or with a pet, and then that would initiate the conversation and create a story. So I think we could be really creative with it sometimes, but clear language, I think, is number one. Like, make sure that we're not trying to soften the blow too much that they don't understand. Kids at 5 may not understand words like passed on. They may not understand what that means. But even at 4 or 5, when we use words like someone died, they have a better understanding. So be clear first. And then over time, we can use words like, they passed on or whatever that might be. But being clear with it initially, and then we again soften that language over time.
As you were saying that, right? Like it reminds me of, I have a memory of my first pet that passed away. I was told went to a farm to get better. He was feeling sick, and so he went to a farm to get better.
Story.
And I'm like, okay. And then just kind of going on. And then we were moving a few months later. It's like, well, how's he going to know where to come back to? And there was almost this this delayed experience. And it was, best of intentions for my parents, but in doing so kind of didn't allow for that transitional experience. And then this dawning realization of, oh, that's what the farm means. Oh, and then so it's kind of like a condensed version. So once again, like those attempts to shield and protect sometimes backfire. And so the ability to kind of encourage, maybe not normalizing in that sense, but encouraging these conversations in a direct way that allows us to create our own experience. And I think one of the most valuable things that can come along with that is, this sharing of stories or sharing of experiences, because I think we can connect so much. And so like, not trying to have it be almost a bit too sterile or a bit too of a clean break. Like the farm was really good for me. Like it went way over my head until it didn't. And then
until
I
it
had to
didn't.
deal with all of it. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that can create, tying in also the story you had of that, the 8 or 10-year-old boy who was upset and felt guilty that he didn't have a chance to actually do something different with his dad and felt bad. It's when we don't give children the benefit of the doubt that they're going to be able to handle the real information, then we're not giving them the opportunity to grieve and to cope the way that they might need to, in our attempts to be soft and gentle around it.
Yeah, I think with all of those examples, I mean, they're good intentions. I mean, it's a protection that we try to do.
Such good intentions.
And I even think we do that with adults. If you ever watch the TV show King of Queens, which is in a bunch of reruns, there's an episode where he and his wife as adults are visiting their parents, and the parents are talking about his dog. And he said, "Oh yeah, I got this dog when I was 7." And his wife calculates and goes, "That makes the dog like 32 years old. Like dogs don't live that long." And then the parents come out and go, "Well, this is Rocky number 4. Like we've had, we just kept replacing the dog." Like, where even as an adult, they weren't dealing with the fact that he could handle the death of the dog. And I think it's funny. Like it was a funny take on something that is, again, as parents, we're protecting our kids, even sometimes protecting our adult kids, instead of just saying, "Hey, this is a part of life." It's that life cycle that we go through, and helping them build the skills that when they face it without us, they have the skills to then do it.
Absolutely. So for our audience, what are and I have so many other questions for you both, but for the sake of time, for our audience, what are the top 5 takeaways as therapists, as clinicians, that you want parenting adults to know?
I could take the first one. I think the first one I would kind of say is start by processing your own emotions. So prepare yourself for those conversations as a parent and think about what words you want to use, how you might want to say them. And also make sure you take a moment to just understand and be with your own emotions for a second.
Yeah.
And that preparation still might result in you being emotional when you talk to your child, and that's okay. It's all right that if that happens, that we don't have to avoid that. I had a situation with my adult children where their grandfather just recently died, and when I told them, I had a pause because I was crying so hard when I did it, and and that's okay. Like it was somebody who's close to me as well, and it gave us a way to be together and be emotional. So prepare yourself and accept your own emotions, I think, is where a first point I would make.
And I think you were even talking a little bit about this one, but the idea of communication, and I would also kind of add in connection as well. Like, whether we are kind of grieving alongside our children, or to that example of if we have a terminal diagnosis, and so again, a different type of grief, but a grief that's going to persist for our children beyond ourselves, like being able to communicate effectively, and so that we have to be intentional. We can't just, we don't want to go off the cuff. So that preparation, but also, the connectedness that is created and formed when we're communicating and open with it. So we're not just shutting it down and potentially, robbing that experience of being intentional and, not feeling like I was a jerk to my dad, or, from my personal example of, being able to have that, goodbye to my, my childhood dog. So having that opportunity.
Yeah. Third one, I think I'd bring up, creating spaces for kids to feel safe in their emotions, whether it's anger, sad, whatever it is, just giving them that opportunity to have that space, and without judgment. Like it's, again, we talk about grief as sad, but I've had people that go through grief who their grief response is they'll giggle when they talk about it. And then everybody looks at them like, how could you do that? It's just their emotional reaction, and not judging people for what that might be, but giving them that place that they can have the emotions that they're having, and we're open to talk about them.
And, alongside that space, I think also not trying to force it to feel like it's everything. So creating how do we maintain a sense of normalcy? Because it allows a structure for us to then kind of create a framework of, okay, here's then, how things are moving forward for myself. And so making a space for it, but also making sure it's not the only space. How do we, continue on with school? How do we continue on with, social interactions, and doing so in that intentional way that gives support, but also then maybe doesn't say like, oh, we have to only be here, because that can feel really daunting. And I think that if that's the case, I think there's also maybe a bit more withdrawing and into ourselves if it doesn't feel like there's a structure that I can grasp onto. So creating that structure.
Yeah, I think that's a great one. And I think last one I would say is we can be creative in how we give outlets to kids. And I think we mentioned, things like we could do arts and crafts, we can do those types of things, but it could also be maybe we do an activity or go to a restaurant that our loved one liked and appreciated, or maybe we go on a family hike and we spend time talking about that person. We don't just have to sit in a room. There's a whole lot of ways, and sometimes I think it's such a healthy way to do things is to try to, again, move forward with the loss that we had and bring that person or pet or situation with us and process it.
I love that. I love that. This was a fantastic and emotional discussion. I very much appreciate the two of you. Thank you so much for being on the show, on the Hey Kiddo podcast.
We loved it. Thanks for having us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Hey Kiddo. If you like what you hear, give us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Learn more about Hey Kiddo at our website, hey-kiddo.com. Have a question for our experts? Email us at hello@hey-kiddo.com.